The night Alexander the Great was expected to die, Babylon did not sleep. The city stretched across the banks of the Euphrates beneath a sky filled with stars, yet the streets that were normally alive with merchants, musicians, and travelers had fallen strangely quiet. Oil lamps flickered outside homes and taverns, illuminating anxious faces gathered in small groups. Everywhere the conversations sounded the same. Some whispered prayers, others exchanged rumors. A few argued about succession, but every discussion returned to a single question: what happens if Alexander dies? Inside the royal palace, the atmosphere was even worse. The conqueror of Persia, Egypt, and half the known world lay motionless beneath linen sheets while physicians moved frantically around the room. Bowls of water sat untouched. Herbal remedies filled the air with bitter scents. Priests had come and gone throughout the day, offering sacrifices to every god they thought might be listening. Nothing seemed to matter. The fever continued to rise. For nearly 2 weeks, Alexander had drifted between consciousness and delirium. At times he spoke clearly. At others he seemed trapped somewhere between memory and dream. One moment he believed he was standing on the plains of Gaugamela watching the Persian army collapse before him. The next he was a young prince again, racing horses through Macedonia while his father shouted instructions from across a training field. The past and present had become impossible to separate. His generals watched helplessly. Men who had marched with him across deserts and mountains stood silently against the walls. They had faced armies numbering in the hundreds of thousands. They had crossed rivers in flood and survived battles that should have destroyed them. Yet none of that experience prepared them for this. An enemy army could be defeated. A fever could not. Outside the chamber, whispers had already begun. Not whispers about Alexander's recovery. Whispers about the future. Who would rule? Would the empire survive? Would the provinces remain loyal? The questions terrified everyone because nobody had answers. The empire Alexander created was unlike anything the world had ever seen. It stretched from Greece to India, linking dozens of cultures, languages, and traditions beneath a single ruler. Yet despite its size, everyone understood a dangerous truth. The empire depended on one man, and that man was dying. As the night deepened, a desert wind swept across Babylon. Dust rattled wooden shutters and carried the distant sounds of temple bells through the city. In another part of the palace, several commanders sat around a table covered in maps. Nobody spoke for a long time. Finally, one of them broke the silence. If he dies, everything changes. No one disagreed, because they all knew it was true. Some imagined civil war. Others imagined governors declaring independence. A few hoped the empire might somehow remain united. Yet hope felt fragile. History offered little reason for confidence. Empires built by extraordinary individuals rarely survive those individuals. Alexander had spent more than a decade conquering the world. He had spent almost no time preparing it to live without him. Hours passed. The palace grew quieter. One by one, servants extinguished lamps throughout the corridors. The city beyond the walls settled into uneasy silence. Then something unexpected happened. A physician checking Alexander's condition paused. For several moments he simply stared. Then he checked again. The pulse felt stronger. Not dramatically stronger, just enough to notice. At first he said nothing. He assumed he had made a mistake. The physician continued his work and returned later. The pulse remained stronger. By sunrise, Alexander's breathing had changed as well. It was deeper, steadier. The fever had not disappeared, but for the first time in days it seemed to be losing ground. Word spread cautiously through the palace. No one wanted false hope. Yet hope appeared anyway. A few hours later, Alexander opened his eyes. The room froze. Physicians stopped moving. Servants stood motionless. One general nearly dropped the cup he was holding. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Then Alexander looked around the room and asked for water. The simplest request imaginable. Yet those two words changed history. Within hours, the palace erupted with activity. Messengers raced through corridors carrying news from chamber to chamber. Guards smiled openly for the first time in days. Physicians who had prepared themselves for failure suddenly found themselves discussing recovery. By evening, the news had escaped the palace entirely. Alexander was alive. The reaction across Babylon was immediate. Crowds gathered in public squares. Temples filled with worshippers. Merchants abandoned their stalls to celebrate. Soldiers who had spent days fearing the worst embraced one another in the streets. The city transformed overnight. The shadow hanging over the empire seemed to vanish. Yet while everyone else celebrated, Alexander spent his recovery confronting a realization that would change him forever. For the first time in his life, he had been powerless. Not against an army, not against a rival king, against time itself. Lying helpless in that room, listening to physicians discuss his condition as though he were already gone, had forced him to consider something he had avoided for years. What would remain after him? For more than a decade, every road in the empire led back to Alexander. Every decision depended upon him. Every governor served because of him. Every alliance existed because of him. It was a magnificent achievement. It was also a weakness. Because if one man's death could threaten an entire civilization, then that civilization had been built on unstable foundations. As his strength slowly returned, Alexander found himself thinking less about conquest and more about permanence. He no longer dreamed of the next battlefield. He dreamed of the next century. And somewhere beyond the walls of Babylon, a future neither he nor anyone else could yet imagine was already beginning to take shape. When Alexander finally appeared before the people of Babylon, the city erupted. Thousands packed the streets leading toward the palace. Men climbed rooftops for a better view. Merchants abandoned their stalls. Soldiers stood shoulder to shoulder beneath banners that fluttered in the desert wind. For weeks they had prepared themselves for the death of the greatest conqueror in history. Now they watched him walk onto a balcony. The cheers could be heard across the city. Alexander raised a hand and the crowd roared even louder. Yet as he looked upon the sea of faces below, he felt something unexpected. Not pride, not triumph, responsibility. For the first time, he saw his empire not as territory on a map, but as millions of lives connected by a single fragile thread. And that thread was him. The realization stayed with him long after the celebrations ended. During the following months, Alexander spent more time reading reports than planning campaigns. Governors from distant provinces sent updates describing harvests, trade disputes, road conditions, and local politics. Normally, such matters would have been delegated to advisors. Now Alexander studied every detail. The empire he had built was vast beyond imagination. From the shores of the Mediterranean to the mountains near India, people lived under his rule. Entire cultures that had once been enemies now depended on the same system for stability. And the more Alexander examined that system, the more he realized how vulnerable it truly was. Messages traveled too slowly. Roads were unreliable. Trade routes depended on local governors. Entire regions could become isolated for months. The empire looked powerful from a distance. Up close, it was held together by hope. One evening, Alexander gathered his closest advisors inside a chamber overlooking the Euphrates River. Maps covered nearly every wall. Some showed military campaigns. Others displayed roads, rivers, ports, and trade routes. The generals expected another war council. Instead, Alexander pointed toward a route stretching from Egypt to Babylon. How long does it take a merchant to travel this distance? He asked. The question confused everyone. One advisor estimated several weeks. Alexander nodded. Then he pointed toward another route. And this one, even longer. Soon the discussion shifted entirely away from war. For hours they debated infrastructure, communication, commerce, and administration. By the end of the meeting, several generals appeared disappointed. One finally spoke. We have armies prepared for conquest. Why are we discussing roads? Alexander walked to the window and looked out across the city. Because roads last longer than victories, the room fell silent. Most of the men present had followed Alexander for years. They had seen him charge directly into enemy formations. They had watched him cross deserts that should have killed entire armies. Yet this version of Alexander felt different. Older, wiser, more dangerous in some ways, because he had stopped thinking about battles and started thinking about centuries. Construction began almost immediately. Across the empire, engineers received orders to improve major routes. Bridges replaced dangerous crossings. Supply stations appeared along important trade roads. New administrative centers connected distant provinces more efficiently than ever before. At first, many citizens barely noticed. Then the effects began appearing everywhere. Merchants reached markets faster. Food traveled farther. Information spread more easily. Wealth increased. For the first time, the empire began functioning as a single connected system rather than a collection of conquered territories. The transformation fascinated Alexander. Yet while roads and trade strengthened the empire, another idea slowly captured his imagination. It began with a city, Alexandria. Years earlier, Alexander had founded the settlement on Egypt's Mediterranean coast. At the time, it was simply one city among many bearing his name. Now reports arriving from Egypt describe something remarkable. The city was growing at an extraordinary pace. Its harbor attracted merchants from across the known world. Ships arrived daily carrying goods from Greece, Egypt, Phoenicia, and lands even farther away. Entire neighborhoods appeared almost overnight. Curious, Alexander decided to see it for himself. The journey took weeks. As the ship approached the coast, the king stood at the bow watching the city emerge from the morning mist. Even from a distance, he could tell something was different. The harbor was crowded with vessels. Construction cranes dominated sections of the shoreline. Warehouses stretched along the waterfront. The city seemed alive. When Alexander finally stepped onto the docks, he found himself surrounded by a world unlike any he had seen before. Greek merchants negotiated with Egyptian traders. Phoenician sailors unloaded cargo beside Persian travelers. Languages blended together in the streets. Ideas moved as freely as goods. For days, Alexander explored the city. The more he saw, the more excited he became. Alexandria occupied a unique position. It sat between continents, between cultures, between worlds. And suddenly, a thought occurred to him. What if Alexandria became more than a city? What if it became the heart of a new civilization? Not through military power, through knowledge. The idea seemed impossible at first. Yet the longer he remained there, the more convinced he became. Every civilization he had encountered possessed valuable knowledge. Egyptians preserved ancient records. Babylonians tracked the movements of stars. Greek philosophers explored mathematics and science. Persian administrators managed vast territories with remarkable efficiency. Yet all that knowledge remained scattered, separated by distance, separated by language, separated by tradition. What would happen if it were brought together? The question refused to leave his mind. By the time Alexander departed Alexandria, he had already begun planning something unprecedented. He would invite scholars from every corner of the empire. He would gather manuscripts. He would create a place where knowledge itself became a source of power, a place unlike anything humanity had ever seen. As his ship sailed away from the harbor, Alexander stood alone at the stern watching the city disappear into the horizon. For years, he had believed his destiny was to conquer the world. Now he wondered if his true purpose was something else entirely, to connect it. And far to the south, beyond the deserts of Arabia, new opportunities were already waiting. The decision surprised almost everyone. When word spread that Alexander was preparing another campaign, the reaction across the empire was immediate. Veterans who had marched with him through Persia sharpened old weapons. Young recruits rushed to join the army. Merchants began stockpiling supplies. Governors prepared for another chapter in the endless expansion of Macedonian power. Most assumed Alexander had returned to his old ambitions. They were wrong. The man who left Babylon years earlier would have seen Arabia as territory to conquer. The man preparing this expedition saw something entirely different: opportunity. The planning began months before the first soldier took a step south. Maps covered entire rooms. Merchants were questioned for hours about trade routes crossing the desert. Sailors described ports along the Arabian coastline. Engineers calculated water requirements for thousands of men moving through some of the harshest landscapes on Earth. For perhaps the first time in his career, Alexander spent more time listening than commanding. One evening, a merchant from Egypt stood before him describing caravans that crossed Arabia carrying incense, spices, ivory, and goods arriving from regions beyond the empire's reach. The merchant pointed to a route stretching across the desert. "If this path falls under your protection," he explained, "every trader between Africa, Arabia, and the Mediterranean will use it." Alexander stared at the map, not because of the wealth, because of the connections. Every road linked people. Every trade route linked civilizations. Every connection made the empire stronger. The campaign was no longer about expanding borders. It was about expanding possibilities. When the army finally departed, the journey felt different from Alexander's earlier wars. There was no desperate race toward a decisive battle. No massive enemy empire waiting on the horizon. Instead, the army advanced carefully through an unfamiliar world. The Arabian landscape seemed endless. Days passed beneath the blazing sun. Mountains rose suddenly from vast stretches of sand. Wind swept across the desert carrying heat so intense that even experienced soldiers struggled to endure it. Yet Alexander appeared energized. At every oasis he spoke with travelers. At every settlement he questioned local leaders. At every port he met sailors who possessed knowledge unavailable anywhere else in the empire. The farther south he traveled, the more he realized how little he truly knew about the world. And that realization excited him. For years, Alexander had been the man with all the answers. Now he was becoming the man asking questions. One afternoon, after weeks of travel, the army arrived at a bustling coastal city unlike anything many Macedonians had ever seen. Ships crowded the harbor. Markets overflowed with goods from distant lands. Languages from across Africa and Arabia echoed through the streets. The city had grown wealthy without conquest. It had grown wealthy through trade. Alexander spent days exploring it. He met merchants who described kingdoms farther south than any Greek map recorded. He listened to sailors who spoke of coastlines stretching beyond the known world. He heard stories about distant civilizations connected by oceans rather than roads. Every conversation expanded the horizon. The world suddenly felt much larger than it had before. One evening, standing on a cliff overlooking the sea, Alexander watched the sun sink beneath the horizon. The water turned gold. Ships appeared as dark silhouettes against the fading light. A young officer approached and stood beside him. For several minutes, neither spoke. Finally, the officer asked a question. "My king, after all these years, what is left to conquer?" Alexander smiled. Years earlier, he would have answered without hesitation. Now he looked toward the endless ocean. "The future." The officer laughed softly, assuming it was a joke. Alexander wasn't joking, because somewhere in that moment, he understood something that would shape the rest of his life. There would always be another city, another kingdom, another battle, but conquest alone could never create the world he imagined. Knowledge could, connection could, discovery could. As the campaign continued, many Arabian leaders chose cooperation over resistance. Trade agreements were signed. Ports joined imperial networks. Caravans gained protection. Routes that had once been dangerous became increasingly secure. The process lacked the drama of Alexander's earlier victories. Yet its impact was far greater. Every agreement strengthened commerce. Every new route increased communication. Every connection brought different cultures closer together. By the time the campaign ended, Arabia had become something more valuable than conquered territory. It had become a bridge linking the empire to opportunities that stretched far beyond its borders. When Alexander finally began the journey back toward Alexandria, he carried more than military success. He carried ideas, stories from merchants, observations from sailors, questions about lands nobody had explored, and a growing belief that humanity stood at the edge of something extraordinary. The world was larger than anyone imagined, and if Alexandria became the center of knowledge he envisioned, then one day its scholars might explore every corner of it. As his fleet crossed the waters toward Egypt, the king found himself thinking less about armies and more about libraries, less about borders and more about discoveries. Without realizing it, Alexander had begun leaving the age of conquest behind. Ahead of him waited Alexandria, and within its growing streets, the foundations of history's greatest library were already taking shape. When Alexander returned to Alexandria, he immediately noticed the difference. The city he had left behind was no longer merely a promising port. It had become a destination. Ships crowded the harbor from sunrise until long after sunset. New districts stretched beyond areas that had been empty only a few years earlier. Construction echoed through the streets. Merchants filled the markets. Travelers from distant lands moved through the city carrying goods, stories, and ideas. Everywhere Alexander looked, the city seemed to be growing. Yet what captured his attention most was not the harbor. It was the people. Among the crowds were philosophers from Athens, astronomers from Babylon, engineers from Egypt, physicians from Persia, and merchants who had traveled farther than most kings ever would. The city was attracting knowledge, and knowledge, Alexander believed, was becoming the most valuable resource in the world. Within weeks of his return, a new project began taking shape. At first, it seemed insignificant. Several buildings near the royal district were designated as places of study. Collections of scrolls were transferred there. Scribes were hired to organize manuscripts arriving from across the empire. Few citizens paid much attention. Libraries already existed. Scholars already studied. Nothing about the project seemed revolutionary. But Alexander saw something nobody else could yet see. He wasn't building a library. He was building a machine. Not a machine made of bronze and gears. A machine made of ideas. Every manuscript added knowledge. Every scholar added perspective. Every debate created new questions. And questions often led to discoveries. The process began slowly. A mathematician from Athens might spend weeks discussing geometry with an Egyptian architect. A Babylonian astronomer could compare centuries of observations with Greek theories about the heavens. Physicians exchanged treatments developed thousands of miles apart. Each conversation produced something new. Not because anyone was inventing knowledge from nothing. Because knowledge was finally being connected. The effect was remarkable. Within a few years, Alexandria developed a reputation unlike any city in history. People no longer traveled there simply to trade. They traveled there to learn. Young students crossed continents hoping to study under famous teachers. Wealthy merchants donated funds to support scholars. Governors competed to send their brightest minds to the city. Knowledge had become a form of prestige, and prestige attracted even more knowledge. One afternoon, while walking through a newly completed section of the growing institution, Alexander encountered a group of scholars engaged in a heated argument. The discussion concerned astronomy. One scholar insisted that traditional observations were correct. Another claimed recent measurements suggested otherwise. The debate had already lasted hours. Neither side showed any sign of surrender. An advisor standing beside Alexander rolled his eyes. They spend more time arguing than working. Alexander smiled. That is their work. The advisor looked puzzled. The king pointed toward the scholars. An empire grows stronger when soldiers challenge enemies. Knowledge grows stronger when scholars challenge ideas. The argument continued long after Alexander left. Years later, participants would still remember that conversation, not because of the debate, because of the king's response. For perhaps the first time in history, intellectual disagreement was being encouraged at the highest level of government. That simple change altered everything. Meanwhile, Alexandria continued expanding. The harbor became one of the busiest in the world. New warehouses lined the waterfront. Markets overflowed with goods arriving from 3 continents. Yet alongside commerce came information. Every ship carried stories. Every traveler carried observations. Every merchant brought knowledge gathered during journeys across deserts, mountains, and oceans. The city became a crossroads not only for trade, but for ideas. And among those ideas, one in particular began attracting attention. Machines. Engineers arriving from different regions brought designs unlike anything previously seen in the Mediterranean. Water pumps from Egypt. Mechanical devices from Greece. Complex irrigation systems from Persia. Most inventions solved practical problems. They lifted water, moved materials, reduced labor. Yet a handful of engineers wanted something more. They wanted to understand why machines worked. That distinction mattered, because once people understand a system, they can improve it. Inside workshops throughout Alexandria, experiments became increasingly common. Gears turned, pulleys lifted weights, water wheels powered small devices. Most citizens ignored these developments. The machine seemed unimportant compared to armies, politics, and trade. History would eventually disagree, because hidden within those workshops were the first signs of a future nobody could yet imagine. One evening, Alexander visited a demonstration organized by several engineers. A crowd gathered around a bronze device placed on a wooden table. The machine appeared unimpressive. A few pipes, a metal container, several rotating components. The engineer lit a fire beneath it. At first, nothing happened. Then steam began escaping through narrow openings. Moments later, a wheel started spinning. Slowly at first, then faster. The crowd laughed. Children pointed excitedly. Many spectators dismissed the machine as a novelty, an entertaining toy, nothing more. Yet Alexander remained silent. He watched the wheel continue spinning, round and round, driven entirely by heated water. Most people saw a curiosity. Alexander saw potential. Because history often begins quietly, not with a battle, not with a proclamation, but with a small idea that nobody takes seriously. And somewhere inside Alexandria, surrounded by scrolls, scholars, and dreamers, the first sparks of a new age had just appeared. The spinning wheel became a fascination within Alexandria, not because it was useful, not yet, because it raised questions. And questions were the currency of the city. In the weeks that followed, scholars returned repeatedly to the workshop where the demonstration had taken place. Some came out of curiosity. Others arrived determined to prove the machine was nothing more than a clever trick. The engineers welcomed both groups. Every visitor offered a new perspective. Every criticism exposed weaknesses. Every question forced them to think harder. The machine itself was simple. Water heated inside a sealed vessel created pressure. That pressure escaped through carefully designed openings, causing a wheel to rotate. The concept was hardly revolutionary, yet the implications were difficult to ignore. For thousands of years, nearly every task performed by civilization had depended upon muscle. Human muscle, animal muscle. Fields were plowed by oxen. Ships were rowed by men. Stone blocks were dragged into position through enormous effort. That was simply how the world worked. But what if there was another source of power? The question spread rapidly through Alexandria's intellectual circles. Most scholars dismissed the idea. A spinning wheel could not replace workers. A bronze toy could not change civilization. The practical limitations seemed obvious. Yet a small group of engineers refused to let the matter go. Among them was an inventor named Philon, a man known throughout the city for turning strange ideas into functioning machines. While others saw entertainment, Philon saw a challenge. If steam could move a wheel, perhaps it could move something larger. The possibility obsessed him. Weeks became months. Months became years. Workshop after workshop experimented with new designs. Some exploded dramatically. Others collapsed under their own weight. Many failed so completely that spectators laughed openly. Failure became common. But unlike most civilizations, Alexandria did not punish failure. It studied it. Every experiment was recorded. Every mistake was documented. Every lesson remained available for the next generation. Knowledge accumulated, and accumulation changes everything. Meanwhile, Alexander continued investing heavily in the city. The library expanded again. Then again. New wings appeared. Additional scholars arrived. Collections grew so rapidly that entire buildings became dedicated to preserving manuscripts. Travelers entering Alexandria often found the city overwhelming. The harbor alone seemed larger than many kingdoms. Ships from across the known world crowded the docks. Merchants discussed trade routes stretching from Spain to India. Scholars debated mathematics in public squares while engineers argued about mechanics inside workshops. The city felt alive in a way few places ever had. Alexander loved it. Whenever political responsibilities allowed, he spent time wandering through the growing intellectual district. He often arrived without ceremony, listening to discussions from the back of lecture halls. Some scholars never even noticed the king standing among them. He preferred it that way. One afternoon, he attended a presentation by a Babylonian astronomer who had spent decades tracking planetary movements. The scholar pointed toward detailed charts covering an entire wall. For generations, Babylonian observers had recorded the motions of stars and planets with remarkable precision. Now, using mathematical methods developed in Greece, those observations were revealing patterns nobody had previously recognized. Alexander sat quietly for hours. When the lecture ended, he remained thoughtful. The discovery itself interested him, but something else fascinated him more. The astronomer's conclusions had only become possible because different cultures were working together. Babylonian observations, Greek mathematics, Egyptian records, combined. No single civilization could have produced the breakthrough alone. The realization reinforced Alexander's growing belief that knowledge multiplied when connected. And nowhere was knowledge more connected than Alexandria. As the years passed, the city became increasingly influential. Young scholars dreamed of studying there. Wealthy patrons funded research. Governors competed to establish schools modeled after its institutions. A culture of learning spread across the empire. The effects appeared everywhere. Engineers improved roads. Architects designed stronger structures. Physicians developed more effective treatments. Merchants adopted better methods of accounting and navigation. Progress was no longer occurring by accident. It was becoming systematic. Yet perhaps the most important change remained invisible. For centuries, people had viewed knowledge as something to preserve. Alexandria transformed it into something to expand. The difference was enormous. A society focused on preserving knowledge protects the past. A society focused on expanding knowledge creates the future. Without realizing it, the empire was beginning to move in that direction. And while scholars debated theories and engineers experimented with steam, events elsewhere were quietly reshaping the world. The trade routes secured during Alexander's Arabian campaign were flourishing beyond expectations. Caravans crossed deserts carrying unprecedented amounts of wealth. Ports along the Red Sea expanded rapidly. Merchants returned with stories from regions few Greeks had ever visited. Some described vast African kingdoms. Others spoke of distant coastlines stretching beyond known maps. Every story hinted at the same possibility. The world was far larger than anyone realized. One evening, As the sun disappeared behind the Mediterranean, Alexander stood on a balcony overlooking Alexandria's harbor. Hundreds of lights reflected across the water. Ships moved slowly through the darkness. The city below buzzed with activity despite the late hour. Years earlier, he would have spent such evenings planning invasions. Now he found himself thinking about exploration, about discovery, about horizons still unseen. The empire had conquered much of the known world, but perhaps the known world was only the beginning. And somewhere beyond the edge of every map hanging inside the library, new mysteries were waiting. Mysteries that future generations of Alexandrian scholars might one day uncover. The age of conquest was fading. The age of discovery was beginning. The first great discoveries of Alexandria did not arrive with applause. They arrived quietly. A new calculation scribbled onto a wax tablet. A correction made to an astronomical chart. A small improvement to an irrigation system used by farmers hundreds of miles away. Most citizens never noticed. Yet together, these discoveries were beginning to transform the empire. By now, Alexandria had become far more than a city. It was a magnet. Every year, ambitious minds arrived seeking opportunity. Some carried scrolls inherited from generations of scholars. Others arrived with little more than curiosity. The city welcomed them all. Its libraries expanded continuously. Lecture halls remained crowded from dawn until evening. Workshops filled entire districts. Public debates attracted audiences larger than some military parades. Knowledge had become entertainment. Knowledge had become prestige. Knowledge had become power. The transformation fascinated Alexander. One morning, while touring a newly completed section of the library, he paused beside a group of young students gathered around a teacher. The lesson concerned geography. A large map covered the wall behind them. The teacher pointed toward regions beyond the empire's borders. Everything beyond this area remains uncertain, he explained. One student raised a hand. How do we know the map is correct? The question drew laughter from several adults nearby. The teacher smiled. Because it is based on the best information available. The student frowned. But what if the information is wrong? The room fell silent. Alexander listened carefully. The teacher considered the question before answering. Then our job is to discover the truth. The king smiled. That single exchange represented everything he hoped Alexandria would become. A place where people questioned assumptions. A place where certainty was challenged. A place where curiosity mattered. Because curiosity changes civilizations. The effects were already becoming visible. Across the empire, engineers designed better bridges and roads. Agricultural production increased as new irrigation methods spread. Physicians exchanged medical knowledge gathered from different cultures. Life improved gradually, then noticeably, then dramatically. People traveled farther, traded more, learned faster. The empire entered a period of prosperity unlike anything it had previously experienced. Yet prosperity created its own challenges. Success attracted attention. Neighboring kingdoms watched Alexandria carefully. Some admired it, others feared it. Many rulers struggled to understand why the city was growing so powerful. They saw libraries, schools, scholars. None of those seemed threatening. What they failed to recognize was that knowledge compounds. A single discovery may change little. Thousands of discoveries change everything. Meanwhile, the engineers experimenting with steam continued their work. Most projects still failed. Machines broke. Pressure vessels burst. Designs proved impractical. Yet each failure produced information. And information never truly disappeared inside Alexandria. Lessons were recorded. Mistakes were analyzed. Ideas evolved. Generation after generation would inherit those lessons. One evening, a demonstration attracted unusual attention. An engineer unveiled a new device capable of lifting heavy weights using a combination of gears, pulleys, and steam pressure. The machine was crude, slow, inefficient. Yet it worked. A crowd gathered immediately. Laborers stared in disbelief. Merchants began asking questions about cost. Engineers pushed closer for a better view. For several minutes, nobody spoke. Then someone asked the obvious question. If it can lift stones, what else can it do? The answer was simple. Nobody knew. And that uncertainty excited people. Because uncertainty meant possibility. The same spirit spread throughout Alexandria. Every question seemed to create 10 more. Every answer opened new doors. The city felt increasingly alive, as though it were thinking, as though it possessed a momentum of its own. Even Alexander sensed it. The project he had imagined years earlier was growing beyond his expectations. He had wanted a center of knowledge. Instead, he was witnessing the birth of a culture built around discovery. And cultures are far more powerful than institutions. Institutions can collapse. Cultures survive. One night, long after most of the city had fallen asleep, Alexander stood alone near the harbor. The Mediterranean stretched endlessly before him. Moonlight reflected across the water. In the distance, ships appeared as dark silhouettes against the horizon. Somewhere beyond that horizon were lands nobody had mapped. Coastlines nobody had explored. Civilizations nobody had encountered. The unknown. Years earlier, the unknown had represented territory to conquer. Now it represented questions to answer. The difference changed everything. Because while kings often dream of expanding borders, scholars dream of expanding understanding. And Alexandria was producing more scholars every year. Soon, those scholars would begin asking questions that reached beyond roads, trade, and politics. Questions about nature. Questions about the stars. Questions about the forces that govern the universe itself. Questions that would lead humanity toward discoveries centuries ahead of their time. The age of learning had begun, and its consequences were only starting to unfold. The questions became bigger. At first, Alexandrian scholars had focused on practical problems. Better roads, better irrigation, better methods of storing grain and organizing trade. These improvements brought prosperity, and prosperity brought stability. But once basic problems were solved, curiosity began reaching further. What caused the seasons to change? Why did certain stars move differently from others? Could earthquakes be predicted? How large was the Earth itself? The questions filled lecture halls and libraries. In earlier civilizations, such discussions might have remained philosophical. Scholars would debate endlessly without ever testing their ideas. Alexandria encouraged something different: observation, measurement, experimentation. If someone made a claim, others attempted to verify it. If a theory explained the heavens, astronomers searched for evidence. If an engineer proposed a new machine, it was built and tested. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, a new way of thinking emerged. Knowledge was no longer accepted because an authority declared it true. Knowledge had to prove itself. The shift was subtle, yet it would eventually become one of the most important developments in human history. Alexander noticed it during a gathering inside one of the city's largest lecture halls. A respected philosopher had spent hours explaining his theory about the movement of celestial bodies. The audience listened attentively. His reputation alone commanded respect. When he finally finished, a young astronomer stood. The room became silent. The philosopher was famous throughout the empire. The astronomer was barely known outside Alexandria. Yet the young man calmly presented observations that contradicted parts of the theory. Several people expected outrage. Instead, something remarkable happened. The philosopher smiled. Then perhaps my theory is incomplete. The discussion continued late into the evening. Nobody cared who was older. Nobody cared who was more famous. Only the evidence mattered. Alexander left the hall deeply impressed. For generations, power had determined truth. In Alexandria, truth was beginning to determine power. That change would outlive every king who ever ruled the empire. Meanwhile, beyond the city's walls, the effects of learning continued spreading. Improved navigation transformed trade routes across the Mediterranean. Merchants reached destinations faster and with greater safety. Agricultural innovations increased harvests throughout Egypt and Mesopotamia. New engineering techniques reduced the time required to construct bridges, ports, and public buildings. The empire grew wealthier with every passing year. Cities expanded. Populations increased. Trade flourished. Many citizens believed they were living through a golden age. They were, but they had no idea how much greater things would become. Inside workshops scattered across Alexandria, engineers continued experimenting with steam-powered devices. Most remained impractical. The machines consumed too much fuel. Their moving parts wore out quickly. Some failed in spectacular fashion. Yet progress continued. One breakthrough led to another. A stronger metal component here. A more efficient valve there. A better understanding of pressure and heat. No single discovery changed everything. Together, however, they were slowly building towards something extraordinary. One afternoon, Alexander visited a workshop where several engineers were testing a new machine designed to pump water. The demonstration began poorly. The device rattled violently. Steam leaked from multiple joints. One wheel refused to turn at all. Several observers laughed. The engineers looked embarrassed. Alexander remained patient. Eventually, after numerous adjustments, the machine started working. Water began flowing steadily from a lower reservoir to a higher channel. The room fell silent. The machine wasn't elegant. It wasn't revolutionary, but it performed a task that normally required teams of workers. The king studied it carefully. Then he asked a simple question. Can it be improved? The lead engineer smiled. Everything can be improved. Alexander liked that answer because it reflected the spirit spreading throughout Alexandria. Nothing was considered finished. Nothing was considered perfect. Everything could be improved. Everything could be understood better. Everything could evolve. Outside the workshop, the city continued growing. Its harbor had become one of the busiest places on Earth. Goods arrived from distant kingdoms. Scholars crossed continents to study there. Travelers carried stories about Alexandria to regions that had never seen the Mediterranean. The city's reputation became legendary. Some called it the greatest center of learning in history. Others claimed it was becoming the greatest city in the world. Neither description felt exaggerated, and still it continued expanding. One evening, while walking through the library after sunset, Alexander paused beside a window overlooking the city. Thousands of lights flickered below. Ships moved through the harbor. Voices echoed through distant streets. The city felt alive. For a moment, he imagined the future. Not his future. The city's future. What would Alexandria look like 100 years from now? 200? 500? Would scholars still walk these halls? Would new discoveries continue appearing? Would the empire remain united? The questions lingered in his mind, because despite all the progress surrounding him, Alexander understood something many others ignored. Great civilizations are not destroyed by weakness. They are destroyed by success. Success creates complacency. Complacency creates decline. The challenge was ensuring that Alexandria never stopped questioning, never stopped learning, never stopped exploring. If it could do that, perhaps it would achieve something no civilization had ever achieved before. Endurance. And somewhere within the workshops, libraries, and observatories of Alexandria, a generation was growing up that had never known a world without learning. A generation that would push the boundaries of knowledge further than Alexander ever imagined. A generation that would soon begin transforming curiosity into invention, and invention into power. Years passed, then decades. The fever that had nearly ended Alexander's life became little more than a story told by old soldiers and aging officials. Children born after his recovery knew him only as the ruler who had united the world and transformed Alexandria into its brightest city. Yet the king himself never forgot. Every major decision he made could be traced back to that room in Babylon. Every road, every school, every library, every investment in knowledge, all of it began with a single realization. One day he would die, and if his civilization depended entirely upon him, it would die too. That fear drove him relentlessly. By now, Alexandria had become the beating heart of the empire. Its harbor connected continents. Its scholars exchanged ideas faster than armies once moved. Entire industries had emerged around learning, engineering, and exploration. Most impressive of all, the city had developed something incredibly rare: momentum. Progress no longer depended on Alexander. The system was beginning to sustain itself. Young scholars taught younger students. Engineers trained apprentices. Researchers built upon the work of previous generations. Knowledge accumulated like a growing river, and rivers become powerful when they are allowed to flow uninterrupted. One morning, a merchant vessel arrived from distant waters beyond Arabia. Its crew carried stories that quickly spread throughout Alexandria. They spoke of unfamiliar coastlines, strange currents, ports unknown to Greek maps. Within days, scholars crowded around navigators demanding details. Maps were redrawn, distances recalculated, arguments erupted. The excitement was contagious. For centuries, people had assumed the world was mostly known. Now evidence suggested otherwise. Entire regions remained unexplored. The realization electrified Alexandria. Exploration suddenly became fashionable. Young nobles sponsored expeditions. Wealthy merchants funded voyages. Scholars competed to participate in journeys beyond established trade routes. Even Alexander found himself drawn into the enthusiasm. He attended planning meetings personally. He questioned sailors for hours. He studied newly drawn maps late into the night. The unknown still called to him. It always had. The difference was that he no longer intended to conquer it. He intended to understand it. The first major expedition departed shortly afterward. 3 ships sailed south from Egyptian waters carrying navigators, merchants, engineers, and scholars. Unlike traditional voyages, this mission had a different purpose. Observation. Everything was recorded. Coastlines, weather patterns, currents, stars, animals, plants. Every detail mattered. Months later, when the ships finally returned, Alexandria erupted with excitement. The explorers brought information unlike anything previously collected. New trade opportunities emerged. Geographical knowledge expanded. Maps became more accurate. Most importantly, the expedition proved something. Curiosity produced results. That lesson spread rapidly throughout the empire. Meanwhile, the workshops of Alexandria continued evolving. The steam devices that once amused crowds were becoming increasingly sophisticated. Engineers developed better methods of controlling pressure. Metalworking techniques improved. Mechanical systems became more reliable. Still, many people remained skeptical. A group of merchants visiting one workshop watched the steam-powered mechanism lift heavy materials and immediately began debating costs. One merchant shook his head. Too complicated. Another agreed. Too expensive. A nearby engineer overheard them and smiled. So were ships once. The merchants laughed. But the engineer had a point. Every transformative technology begins as something inefficient, something impractical, something people underestimate. The future rarely announces itself. It arrives quietly. Alexandria was learning that lesson firsthand. Every year brought another breakthrough. None seemed world-changing on their own. Together, however, they were creating something extraordinary. A civilization increasingly powered by ideas rather than tradition, by evidence rather than assumption, by discovery rather than inheritance. One evening, Alexander attended a gathering inside the library's largest hall. Hundreds of scholars filled the room. The atmosphere felt almost festive. Researchers presented new findings. Astronomers shared observations. Engineers demonstrated inventions. Physicians discussed treatments. The event lasted hours. As Alexander watched, he noticed something remarkable. Most of the people speaking had never met him before. Many had been born long after his greatest military victories. Some knew him only as an aging ruler. Yet every one of them was contributing to a future he had helped create. For the first time, Alexander realized he was no longer the most important person in the room. And that made him happier than any battlefield victory he ever had. Because it meant the empire had matured. It could think for itself. It could innovate without him. It could survive him. Later that night, after the gathering ended, Alexander walked alone through the library. Rows of scrolls stretched into darkness. The air smelled of papyrus and oil lamps. Somewhere nearby, scholars continued debating despite the late hour. The king smiled. Years earlier, he had dreamed of ruling the world. Now he stood inside something greater, a place where knowledge itself was becoming the engine of civilization, a place that might continue shaping history long after his name became legend. And beyond the walls of Alexandria, a new generation was already preparing to take that story further, much further, because the age of learning was about to give birth to something even more powerful, the age of invention. The first true invention to emerge from Alexandria did not look impressive. It wasn't a grand monument. It wasn't a war machine. It wasn't even particularly beautiful. Most people who saw it for the first time barely paid attention. The device sat inside a crowded workshop near the harbor, surrounded by tools, metal fragments, and stacks of notes. To an untrained eye, it appeared little different from dozens of other experimental machines scattered throughout the city. Yet the engineers working around it understood something important. This machine was different, not because of what it was, because of what it represented. For generations, scholars had focused on understanding the world. They observed the stars, studied mathematics, recorded history, developed theories. Now, that knowledge was beginning to create practical results. The machine existed because hundreds of discoveries had accumulated over decades. Knowledge about pressure, knowledge about metals, knowledge about mechanics, knowledge about mathematics. None of those discoveries alone would have changed history. Together, however, they created possibility. That realization spread quickly through Alexandria. Young students no longer viewed learning as merely an intellectual pursuit. Learning became a path toward invention, and invention became a path toward influence. Soon workshops appeared across entire districts of the city. Engineers experimented constantly. Some focused on transportation. Others explored construction techniques. A few became obsessed with energy itself. Questions filled the air. How could machines move faster? How could ships travel farther? How could cities support larger populations? Every answer created new questions. The cycle accelerated. One afternoon, an engineer demonstrated a system capable of moving heavy cargo using a combination of gears and mechanical power. Merchants immediately recognized the economic implications. Labor costs could decrease. Construction could accelerate. Trade could expand. The invention spread rapidly. Competing workshops improved the design within months. Then someone improved it again. Then again. The process became familiar. Discovery, improvement, expansion, repeat. Alexandria had unknowingly created something rare, a culture of innovation, and cultures are difficult to stop. Meanwhile, the empire continued benefiting from the city's influence. Roads became more sophisticated. Ports became more efficient. Agricultural production increased across multiple provinces. Life improved almost everywhere. Citizens might not understand the scientific principles driving these changes, but they experienced the results daily. Food became cheaper. Travel became easier. Communication became faster. Prosperity spread. As prosperity increased, so did confidence. Many citizens began believing the empire had entered a permanent golden age. Alexander remained cautious. Age had changed him. Experience had humbled him. He knew history too well to trust success completely. Every great civilization believed it would last forever. Most were wrong. That concern became increasingly important as Alexander grew older. His hair had begun turning gray. Long campaigns that once seemed effortless now left him exhausted. The scars collected throughout years of warfare occasionally reminded him of battles fought decades earlier. Time was catching up. Even conquerors could not defeat it. The realization forced him to confront another difficult question. What happens after me? Unlike the frightened generals who had whispered about succession in Babylon years earlier, Alexander now possessed options. The empire was stronger. Its institutions were stronger. Its culture was stronger. Yet uncertainty remained. No ruler could govern forever. One evening, while watching ships enter Alexandria's harbor, Alexander spoke privately with one of his closest advisors. "Do you think it survives?" he asked. The advisor looked confused. "The empire." Alexander nodded. The man considered the question carefully. Years earlier, the answer might have been uncertain. Now it felt obvious. Yes. Alexander seemed surprised. The advisor pointed toward the city. "Because it no longer belongs to one man." The response lingered in Alexander's thoughts long after the conversation ended. Perhaps that was the greatest achievement of all. Not conquest, not territory, not wealth. Independence. The civilization he created was learning to stand on its own. Meanwhile, inside Alexandria's workshops, another generation of inventors was emerging. Young engineers who had grown up surrounded by libraries, experiments, and discovery. To them, curiosity was normal. Questioning assumptions was expected. Innovation was simply part of life. And unlike their predecessors, they inherited centuries of accumulated knowledge. They were starting from a higher foundation, which meant they could reach even greater heights. Some focused on machines. Others studied navigation. A few became fascinated by the stars. Nobody realized it yet, but these young thinkers would soon transform Alexandria from a center of learning into something far more powerful. A center of invention. A place where ideas no longer remained trapped inside books. A place where ideas changed the world. And as the city continued growing beneath the Mediterranean sun, the next great chapter of its story was already beginning. Because knowledge had taught Alexandria how the world worked, the next step was learning how to reshape it. The transformation happened so gradually that few people noticed it at first. For decades, Alexandria had been known as a city of scholars. Travelers crossed continents to study there. Philosophers filled lecture halls. Astronomers mapped the heavens. Mathematicians debated theories late into the night. Knowledge was the city's greatest treasure. Now that treasure was beginning to produce something new. Power. Not military power. Not political power. The power to change reality itself. Inside workshops scattered throughout Alexandria, inventions were becoming increasingly sophisticated. Engineers who once spent years creating simple improvements now built machines capable of tasks previous generations considered impossible. Water systems expanded across entire regions. Mechanical devices assisted construction projects. Agricultural tools improved harvests. Each breakthrough seemed small, yet together they created momentum. The empire was changing faster than any civilization before it. One spring morning, merchants arriving from distant provinces noticed something unusual. Entire construction projects that once required years were being completed in months. Roads expanded faster. Bridges appeared sooner. Ports handled larger volumes of cargo. The difference was impossible to ignore. Efficiency had become a force of its own. The economy responded immediately. Trade increased. Cities expanded. Population grew. For ordinary citizens, life steadily improved. Most people never saw the workshops responsible. They simply experienced the results. A farmer harvested more grain. A merchant reached markets faster. A traveler crossed a bridge that hadn't existed a few years earlier. Progress became part of everyday life, and because it happened gradually, many failed to appreciate how extraordinary it truly was. Meanwhile, Alexandria continued attracting brilliant minds from every corner of the known world. By now, children born in the city viewed its libraries as normal. They grew up surrounded by scholars, inventions, and debates. To them, discovery was not unusual. It was expected. That expectation changed everything. When a civilization expects progress, progress accelerates. Young students challenged older teachers. Engineers questioned accepted designs. Astronomers revisited ancient assumptions. The culture rewarded curiosity, and curiosity rarely remains contained. One evening, a public demonstration drew a crowd larger than anyone anticipated. Word had spread through the city that a group of engineers had developed an improved mechanical system capable of moving cargo more efficiently than traditional methods. People arrived expecting entertainment. Instead, they witnessed possibility. The machine was noisy, imperfect, crude by future standards. Yet as it performed work normally requiring dozens of laborers, the crowd slowly fell silent. Some stared in disbelief. Others immediately began imagining practical uses. Merchants saw profits. Builders saw opportunity. Engineers saw potential. Alexander, now an older man with silver beginning to dominate his hair, watched from a distance. The machine itself interested him. The reaction interested him more. Years earlier, people would have laughed at such inventions. Now they were asking how quickly they could be improved. That shift in mindset mattered. It meant innovation had become part of the culture, no longer dependent upon individual geniuses, no longer dependent upon royal support. The process could continue on its own, and that realization brought Alexander a rare sense of peace. Because for the first time since Babylon, he truly believed the future might survive him. Yet even as Alexandria flourished, new questions emerged. The empire had explored much of the known world. Trade routes stretched across continents. Maps grew increasingly detailed. What came next? Many believed humanity had reached the limits of discovery. The younger generation disagreed. Inside lecture halls and libraries, discussions increasingly focused on unfamiliar possibilities. Could ships travel farther than ever before? Could oceans connect lands not yet mapped? Could entirely new civilizations exist beyond the horizon? The question sounded ambitious, even unrealistic. But Alexandria had developed a habit of turning impossible questions into achievable goals. And somewhere among the students studying beneath the library's towering shelves sat individuals who would spend their lives chasing those answers. The age of learning had created the age of invention. Soon, the age of invention would create the age of exploration. And when that happened, the world itself would become larger than anyone had ever imagined. The descendants of Alexander would inherit an empire unlike any in history. An empire connected not only by roads and armies, but by ideas. And ideas travel farther than armies ever can. The first great age of exploration began with a question, not from a king, not from a general, from a student. The story became famous throughout Alexandria. During a lecture on geography, a young scholar stood before a map that covered an entire wall of the library. The map represented the known world as accurately as anyone could draw it. Coastlines, trade routes, rivers, and cities stretched across parchment assembled from years of observation. The professor pointed proudly at the chart. "This," he declared, "is the world." The students stared at the empty spaces beyond the edges of the map. Then he asked a simple question. How do we know? The room laughed. The professor smiled patiently. We have centuries of records. But have we seen all of it? The laughter stopped. The question lingered. Because nobody could answer it with certainty. Alexandria loved questions like that. Questions that exposed assumptions. Questions that forced people to think. Within months, debates spread throughout the city. Scholars revisited old maps. Merchants shared stories from distant voyages. Sailors described currents leading toward unknown waters. The evidence pointed toward an uncomfortable possibility. The world was larger than they believed. Much larger. For generations, people had treated the edges of maps as limits. Now they began treating them as invitations. The shift changed everything. Expeditions received new funding. Shipbuilders were commissioned to design larger vessels capable of longer journeys. Navigation became one of the most respected fields of study in Alexandria. Young students who once dreamed of becoming philosophers now dreamed of becoming explorers. The city had developed a new obsession: the horizon. One evening, inside a crowded harbor tavern, a weathered sailor described a voyage that had taken him farther south than any map recorded. His audience listened carefully as he spoke of unfamiliar coastlines and stars positioned differently in the sky. Most stories of exploration were exaggerated. This one felt different. Several scholars immediately requested interviews. Measurements were compared. Observations analyzed. The sailor's account appeared genuine. Excitement spread rapidly. Every new piece of information suggested the same thing. Humanity knew less about the world than it imagined. For Alexandria, that realization was thrilling. Ignorance was not a weakness. It was an opportunity. Meanwhile, the city's workshops continued evolving. The engineers who once built simple mechanical devices were now designing increasingly complex systems. New tools improved ship construction. Better navigation instruments emerged from collaborations between astronomers and craftsmen. Knowledge from one discipline constantly influenced another. A discovery in mathematics improved engineering. A breakthrough in astronomy improved navigation. A new material improved manufacturing. The cycle accelerated year after year. No civilization had ever experienced anything like it. And because the process unfolded gradually, most citizens failed to appreciate its significance. They simply assumed progress was normal. That assumption would become one of Alexandria's greatest strengths. Children grew up expecting the future to be better than the past. That belief motivated them to create it. As Alexander entered the final years of his life, he spent increasing amounts of time observing rather than directing. The empire functioned efficiently. Trade flourished. Knowledge expanded. The institutions he built no longer depended entirely on him. Sometimes he walked through Alexandria disguised in ordinary clothing, accompanied only by a small number of guards. He enjoyed listening. Students discussing astronomy. Merchants arguing about trade. Engineers debating inventions. Every conversation revealed the same pattern. The city was thinking. Constantly, relentlessly. It reminded him of an army preparing for battle. Except this army fought ignorance, and it was winning. One afternoon, Alexander visited the harbor and watched several newly constructed exploration vessels preparing for departure. The ships looked different from traditional merchant vessels. Stronger, larger, designed specifically for long voyages. Crews moved across the decks carrying supplies that would last months. Scholars loaded instruments and maps. The atmosphere buzzed with anticipation. A young navigator noticed the king watching and approached respectfully. "My king," he said, "do you think we'll find anything?" Alexander smiled. The question reminded him of his younger self. Years ago, he would have spoken about victory, about conquest, about glory. Instead, he looked toward the open sea. "I hope so." The navigator seemed surprised. "You hope so?" Alexander nodded. "If we already know what we're going to find, then why explore?" The young man smiled. A few days later, the ships departed. Hundreds gathered along the harbor to watch. Families waved from the docks. Scholars recorded observations. Merchants calculated possibilities. As the sails disappeared beyond the horizon, nobody knew exactly what the expedition would discover. But everyone understood something important. The purpose of exploration was no longer expansion. It was understanding. And understanding has no borders. The age of conquest had created an empire. The age of learning had created a civilization. Now the age of exploration was beginning. And beyond the horizon waited discoveries that would transform Alexandria, the empire, and perhaps the entire course of human history. The expedition was gone for nearly 8 months. At first, Alexandria barely noticed. The harbor remained crowded. Merchants continued arriving from distant provinces. Scholars filled the lecture halls. Engineers worked late into the night inside workshops illuminated by oil lamps. Life continued. Yet as the months passed, curiosity began growing. Every ship entering the harbor caused excitement. Every distant sail prompted speculation. Students gathered around maps discussing possible routes. Merchants debated what discoveries might return with the explorers. Nobody realized how much they wanted answers until they had to wait for them. Then one morning, the city erupted. A lookout station near the harbor spotted familiar sails approaching from the south. Within minutes, word spread through Alexandria. The expedition had returned. Crowds flooded toward the waterfront. Merchants abandoned negotiations. Scholars rushed from libraries. Workers left construction sites. Thousands gathered along the docks. Even before the ships reached shore, excitement filled the air. The vessels looked weathered. Their sails were worn. Their hulls carried scars from storms and months at sea. Yet they were intact. And more importantly, they carried stories. The moment the ships docked, officials, scholars, and curious citizens surrounded the returning crews. The explorers had traveled farther than anyone expected. They described coastlines that stretched beyond existing maps. They recorded currents unknown to Mediterranean sailors. They documented new species of plants and animals. Most importantly, they returned with evidence. The world was larger, much larger. For decades, maps hanging inside Alexandria's libraries had represented humanity's understanding of the Earth. Now scholars were forced to redraw them. Entire sections changed. Distances increased. New coastlines appeared. The discoveries triggered a wave of excitement unlike anything the city had experienced before. Students dreamed of future voyages. Merchants imagined new markets. Engineers discussed improvements to ships. The expedition had proven something important. There was still more to discover. The age of exploration accelerated. Within a few years, multiple expeditions departed annually. Some traveled south, others pushed east. A few ventured into waters that many sailors still considered dangerous. Each voyage returned with information, and information became Alexandria's most valuable resource. The library expanded again. Entire departments emerged dedicated to geography, navigation, and exploration. Maps became increasingly sophisticated. Astronomers collaborated with navigators to improve long-distance travel. Knowledge from one field constantly strengthened another. The system was working exactly as Alexander had hoped. Yet even he could not have predicted how powerful it would become. One afternoon, while reviewing reports from several expeditions, Alexander noticed a pattern. Many discoveries occurred not because explorers found something entirely new. They occurred because different pieces of knowledge had finally been connected. And astronomers' observations improved navigation. Navigation improved exploration. Exploration improved geography. Geography improved trade. Trade generated wealth. Wealth funded research. Research produced new discoveries. The cycle fed itself endlessly. For perhaps the first time in history, progress had become self-sustaining. The realization fascinated Alexander. Civilizations normally advanced slowly. A discovery might take generations to spread. Knowledge was often lost during wars or political upheaval. Alexandria was different. Knowledge accumulated. It was preserved. Should improve. The city had become a machine for generating progress, and machines tend to accelerate. By now, a generation had grown up knowing nothing else. Young scholars entering the library assumed discoveries would continue indefinitely. New inventions appeared regularly. New theories emerged constantly. Progress no longer felt remarkable. It felt normal. That change in mindset may have been Alexandria's greatest achievement. People stopped asking whether the future could be better. They started asking how much better it could become. Meanwhile, the engineers continued pushing boundaries. Mechanical systems grew increasingly sophisticated. Water-powered machinery expanded across parts of the empire. Workshop tools became more efficient. Experiments with steam continued. Most devices remained limited, yet limitations were shrinking. Slowly, steadily, relentlessly. Every generation inherited the knowledge of the one before it. Every generation started from a higher foundation. The effect was powerful. A discovery that once required a lifetime could now be understood in a few years. Students learned more, faster, and because they learned more, they could achieve more. One evening, as the sun disappeared beyond the Mediterranean, Alexander stood atop a terrace overlooking Alexandria. The city stretched in every direction. Its harbor glowed with hundreds of lights. The library dominated the skyline. Ships arrived from distant lands carrying goods, ideas, and opportunities. The sight filled him with pride, not because he had built it alone, because it no longer belonged to him. The city had become something larger than any ruler, a civilization driven by curiosity, a civilization built around learning, a civilization capable of outliving kings. And somewhere among the students studying beneath the library's lamps sat individuals who would one day achieve things even Alexander considered impossible. The conqueror had united the world he knew. The generations that followed would begin uncovering the world he never knew existed. And in doing so, they would push humanity toward an age unlike anything history had ever seen.